The words still burn in my chest like a fire that refuses to die. "You're not family anymore, Mom." My son Daniel said that to me, his voice cold as winter, his eyes not even meeting mine. I stood in the kitchen of my childhood home, the same kitchen where I'd bandaged his scraped knees and baked his birthday cakes, and I felt the ground shift beneath me. I'm Agnes, 66 years old, and I never thought I'd live to hear my only child cast me out like a stranger. But there I was, clutching the edge of the counter, my knuckles white, trying to breathe through the ache that felt like it might swallow me whole. This house, with its creaky floors and chipped white paint, has been my anchor. I grew up here running through the backyard with my brothers chasing fireflies under my mother's watchful eye. After my husband Tom passed 5 years ago, it became my refuge again. I moved back, needing the comfort of those old walls, the whispers of my parents' laughter, still lingering in the corners. Daniel was grown by then, married to a woman who never warmed to me, with a life I thought was steady. I was proud of him, my boy who'd always had a spark in his eyes, even when the world tried to dim it. But that spark turned to something else over the years, something reckless, hungry and cruel. I raised Daniel alone after Tom's heart gave out. He was a good father, but his time was cut short, and I became both mother and father, piecing together a life for us on a seamstress's wages. I worked nights stitching wedding dresses for brides who'd never know the calluses on my hands, just so Daniel could have school books and sneakers that fit. I never complained, not once. A mother doesn't. You carry the weight because it's yours to carry, because love makes it bearable. But love, I learned, doesn't always flow both ways. Flow both. It started small, the distance between us. Daniel's calls grew shorter, his visits rarer. His wife Laura would smile tightly when I came to their apartment, her eyes flicking to the clock like I was an appointment to endure. I told myself it was just life, marriage, work, the busyness of youth. But then the gambling started. I found out by accident, overhearing a neighbor whisper about Daniel's debts at the corner store. My heart sank, but I didn't confront him. I waited, hoping he'd come to me, his mother, for help. He did eventually, but not for guidance. He wanted money. The first time I gave it to him, I sold my mother's pearl earrings, the ones she wore at her wedding, and handed him the cash without a word. He promised it was a one-time thing, his face flushed with shame. I believed him because I wanted to. But the calls kept coming, each one more desperate, each one chipping away at the savings I'd scraped together for my own quiet years. I sold more my father's old watch, a quilt my grandmother made, until there was little left. Still, he asked. And when I finally said no, when I told him I couldn't keep bleeding for his mistakes, that's when he said it. "You're not family anymore, Mom." He stood in my doorway, his jaw tight, and walked away, leaving me in a house that suddenly felt too big, too empty. I didn't cry that night. I wanted to, but the tears wouldn't come. Instead, I sat in the living room staring at the faded wallpaper, the same pattern I'd traced with my fingers as a girl. I thought about my mother, how she'd braid my hair in this very room, her hands steady and warm. I thought about Tom, how he'd whistle while fixing the porch swing, his laughter filling the air. This house held every piece of me, every joy, every loss, and now it held this too the moment my son turned his back on me. I felt old, not just in years, but in spirit, like the world had decided I was done being seen. The days that followed were a blur of silence. Daniel didn't call, didn't write. Laura sent a single text, curt and formal, saying they were taking space. I learned from a mutual friend that they'd moved into my house, my childhood home, without asking. Daniel assumed it was his that I'd just handed over because I was his mother, because mothers give everything, don't they? I walked through the rooms, seeing their things scattered where mine used to be, and I felt like a ghost in my own life. They didn't invite me to stay, didn't offer a room. I was a visitor, tolerated at best, until Daniel's patience ran out and he told me to leave. I packed a single suitcase, my hands shaking as I folded my clothes. I took my wedding photo with Tom, a few letters from my parents, and the locket my daughter, my sweet girl who died at 3, used to clutch in her tiny hands. I left everything else behind because what's the use of holding on to things when the people you love let you go? I moved into a small apartment in town, a place with thin walls and a view of a parking lot. At night, I'd lie awake listening to the hum of the neighbor's television, wondering how I'd become a woman whose own son didn't want her. I tried to reach out one last time. I wrote Daniel a letter, pouring out my heart, telling him I loved him, that I'd always be his mother no matter what. I left it in the mailbox at my house, hoping he'd read it. He never responded. Weeks later, I saw the letter in the trash, unopened, its edges crumpled like it had been tossed without a second thought. That's when I knew. He wasn't just angry. He was done with me. I don't know how to describe the pain of that moment. It's not sharp like a cut, but heavy like a stone pressing on your chest until you can't breathe. I'd given him everything: my youth, my heart, my home, and he'd thrown it away. I walked back to my apartment, the autumn leaves crunching under my shoes, and I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not yet, but a quiet resolve like a seed buried deep waiting for rain. I wasn't ready to fight, not then. But I knew I couldn't let this be the end of me. The town was changing around me, had been for years. The sleepy streets of my childhood were gone, replaced by construction cranes and real estate signs. Developers were buying up old properties, turning farmland into subdivisions, and the value of my house, my parents' house, had climbed higher than I'd ever imagined. I'd ignored the offers that came in the mail, polite letters from men in suits who saw dollar signs where I saw memories. But that night, as I sat alone in my apartment, I pulled one of those letters from the drawer. I read it, then read it again. And for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of something like power. I didn't decide anything right away. I wasn't ready to let go of the house, not completely. It was more than wood and brick. It was my history, my heart. But the idea of selling, of taking something back for myself, planted itself in my mind. I went to bed that night, the letter still on the table, and I dreamed of the ocean. Not the gray, choppy waves of the nearby coast, but a warm, endless blue, the kind you see in pictures of places you'll never go. I woke up with the taste of salt on my lips, and I knew something had to change. I just didn't know what or how or if I had the strength to do it. The weeks after I found Daniel's letter in the trash stretched into a kind of gray haze each day, blending into the next, until time felt like a weight I couldn't shake. My apartment, with its peeling paint and the faint smell of mildew, became a cage. I'd wake before dawn, not because I wanted to, but because sleep had become a fickle friend, slipping away when I needed it most. I'd sit by the window, watching the parking lot come to life, delivery trucks, mothers hurrying children to school, men in suits rushing to nowhere, and I'd wonder how the world kept moving when mine had stopped. Loneliness is a quiet thief. It doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It creeps in, stealing pieces of you until you're left wondering who you used to be. I stopped answering the phone. Not that it rang often. The few friends I had from my sewing days had their own lives, their own grandchildren, their own joys. I didn't want to burden them with my grief, didn't want to be the woman who only called to complain. So I kept to myself, cooking simple meals, soup from a can, toast with a scrape of butter because even food had lost its taste. The locket with my daughter's picture stayed around my neck, its weight a reminder of a loss I'd learned to carry. But this new wound, Daniel's rejection, was raw and unfamiliar. I avoided the house. My house. I couldn't bear to see Daniel's car in the driveway, Laura's curtains in the windows, the life they were building on the bones of my past. But the town was small, and there was no escaping the whispers. At the grocery store, the cashier, a girl who'd gone to school with Daniel, gave me a pitying look as she scanned my canned beans. Heard Daniel's fixing up your old place. she said, her voice too bright, like she was trying to make it sound normal. I knotted my throat tight and left without saying a word, fixing it up, as if I'd handed it over willingly, as if I'd chosen to be erased. The worst moments came at night when the silence was loudest. I'd lie in bed staring at the ceiling and replay Daniel's words. "You're not family anymore." I'd search for the moment I'd failed him, the mistake I'd made that turned my boy into a man who could say such a thing. Was it when I worked too many nights leaving him with neighbors? Was it when I didn't see the gambling until it was too late? Or was it simpler, just the way life bends, some people until they break? I didn't have answers, only questions, and they gnawed at me like termites in the walls. But even in the darkest moments, something stubborn in me refused to die. Maybe it was my mother's voice, faint but steady, telling me to keep going. Maybe it was Tom's memory, his hand on my shoulder, promising we'd weather any storm. Or maybe it was just me, Agnes, too tired to give up. One morning, I woke to the sound of birds outside my window, their chatter sharp and insistent. I don't know why, but I got out of bed and opened the curtains, letting light spill across the floor. It wasn't much, but it was a start. That day, I went to the library. It was a small act, one most people wouldn't think twice about, but for me, it felt like defiance. I hadn't been there in years, not since Daniel was a boy, and we'd read adventure books together, his head on my shoulder. The librarian, a woman about my age with kind eyes and a gray bun, smiled as I walked in. "Haven't seen you in a while, Agnes," she said, her voice warm, not pitying. I nodded, unsure what to say, and wandered to the biography section. I picked up a book about a woman who'd rebuilt her life after losing everything: a war, a husband, a home. Her story wasn't mine, but it stirred something in me, a spark I hadn't felt in months. I started going to the library every few days, borrowing books about women who'd faced the unthinkable and come out stronger. I read about artists, explorers, mothers who'd carried their families through fire. Each story was a thread stitching me back together piece by piece. The librarian, whose name was Ruth, noticed my choices and started setting aside books she thought I'd like. "This one's about a woman who sailed across the Atlantic alone," she'd say, sliding a worn paperback across the counter. "Reminds me of you somehow." I'd laugh a small, rusty sound and take the book home, wondering what she saw in me that I couldn't. Ruth became my first friend in this new, lonely chapter. She didn't pry, didn't ask about Daniel or the house, but she'd offer me tea in the library's break room, and we'd talk about small things: the weather, a new book, the roses in her garden. One afternoon, as we sipped chamomile from chipped mugs, she told me about her own son who'd moved across the country and rarely called. "It's not the same," she said quickly, catching the shadow in my eyes, "but I know what it's like to miss someone who's still here." Her words landed softly like a hand on my arm, and I realized I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. I started walking more, too. Not far, just around the block then, to the park a mile away. The exercise was good, but it was the air, the sharp bite of autumn, the smell of leaves that woke me up. I'd sit on a bench by the pond watching ducks glide across the water, and I'd let myself think about the house. Not with anger, not yet, but with a kind of clarity. It was mine legally, morally, in every way that mattered. My parents had left it to me, not Daniel, and I'd kept it in my name, because it was my safety net, my piece of the past I couldn't let go. But Daniel had taken it not with a deed, but with assumption, with entitlement, and I'd let him. That realization stung, but it also lit a fire in me, small but steady. One evening as I walked home, I passed a real estate office, its window glowing with photos of houses for sale. I stopped my breath, fogging in the cool air, and stared at a picture of a cottage by the sea. It was nothing like my house, modern, sleek, with windows that caught the light, but it called to me the way dreams do when you're too tired to hope. I didn't go inside, didn't ask for a brochure, but I took a picture of the sign with my phone, my hands trembling. It felt like a secret. Something, just for me. Back at my apartment, I pulled out the developer's letter again, the one I'd kept in the drawer. I read it carefully this time, noting the numbers, the promises of a quick sale. The figure they offered was staggering, more than I'd ever imagined, thanks to the town's growth and the new highway cutting through. I folded the letter and tucked it away, not ready to decide, but the spark in me grew brighter. I wasn't sure what I'd do, but I knew I couldn't stay invisible forever. That night, I dreamed of my daughter Emily for the first time in years. She was 3 again, her curls bouncing as she ran through the backyard, giggling as I chased her. In the dream, she stopped and looked at me, her eyes wise beyond her years. "You're still here, Mommy," she said, and then she was gone, leaving me with the sound of waves. I woke with tears on my cheeks, but they weren't bitter. They were cleansing like rain on parched earth. I got up, made coffee, and sat by the window watching the sunrise. For the first time in months, I felt like Agnes again, not just a mother, not just a widow, but a woman with a life still worth living. The days began to feel less like a sentence and more like a rhythm, a quiet pulse that carried me forward, even when I wasn't sure where I was going. I was still alone, still waking to the hum of my neighbor's television through the thin walls, but the weight of Daniel's words, "You're not family anymore," was starting to shift. It didn't hurt less, but it was becoming something I could carry, like the locket around my neck, a piece of pain that was mine to hold, not to drown in. I was Agnes, 66 years old, and I was learning slowly that I could still be me without being his mother first. My walks grew longer, my steps surer. I'd leave my apartment with a scarf around my neck, the autumn chill biting my cheeks, and head to the park or the library, sometimes both. The town was alive with change, new storefronts, construction dust in the air, young families moving in where old neighbors had moved out. It made me feel like a relic sometimes, a woman out of step with the world. But it also reminded me that life didn't stop, not even when your heart was broken. I'd watch children chase each other in the park, their laughter sharp and bright, and I'd think of Daniel at that age, his small hand in mine. The memory didn't cut as deeply anymore. It was softer, like a bruise fading. Ruth the librarian became my anchor. We'd sit in the break room, our tea cooling in mismatched mugs, and talk about everything and nothing. She had a way of listening that made you feel seen, not judged. And I found myself telling her things I hadn't said aloud in years, stories about Tom, about sewing dresses, until my fingers bled, about the night Emily died, and the silence that followed. I didn't talk about Daniel, not directly, but Ruth seemed to understand. One afternoon, she handed me a book about a woman who'd walked across a desert to find herself. She was older than you when she did it, Ruth said, her eyes twinkling. No one thought she could, but she did. I took the book home, and as I read, I felt a quiet strength stirring in me like a river finding its course. I started sewing again, something I hadn't done since Tom passed. My old machine was in storage, buried under boxes in a rented unit across town, so I took a bus to retrieve it. The driver, a man with a gray beard and a kind smile, helped me carry it to my apartment. "Heavy old thing," he said, chuckling. "Must have made a lot of memories." I knotted my throat tight and thanked him. That night, I set the machine up on my kitchen table, its familiar hum filling the room like an old friend's voice. I didn't have much fabric, just some scraps I'd kept, but I started piecing them together, stitching without a plan. It wasn't about making something perfect. It was about creating, about remembering I could still make something beautiful. The sewing brought back memories of my mother, her hands guiding mine as we made curtains for this very house, my childhood home, the one Daniel now claimed as his. I'd sit at the table, the needle humming, and think about those summers, the smell of her lavender soap, the way she'd hum hymns under her breath. The house was hers, before it was mine, a gift she and my father left me when they passed, not because I was their only child, but because they knew I'd cherish it. Daniel had never understood that. To him, it was just a house, a thing to own, not a tapestry of love and loss. The thought of him there, living rent-free, hanging his pictures where mine used to be, sparked something in me. Not anger, but a quiet resolve like the moment before a storm breaks. I started noticing the real estate signs, more their bright colors popping up on every corner. The town was booming, and my house sitting on a large lot near the new highway was worth more than I'd ever dreamed. The developer's letter was still in my drawer, its edges worn from being handled so often. I hadn't called the number, hadn't committed, but I'd started researching quietly at the library. Ruth showed me how to use the computer, her patience endless, as I fumbled with the mouse. I looked up property values, zoning laws, the kinds of things I'd never needed to know before. The numbers were staggering enough to change a life, enough to start over. I wasn't ready to decide, but the knowledge was power, and I held it close like a secret I wasn't ready to share. One day, as I walked home from the park, I passed a community center with a sign for a painting class. I don't know what made me stop, maybe the memory of Emily, who loved to smear colors on paper, or maybe just a whim, but I went inside. The woman at the desk, a cheerful retiree named Clara, handed me a flyer. "It's for beginners," she said. "No pressure, just fun." I signed up, my hands shaking as I wrote my name, feeling like I was stepping off a cliff. The class was small, mostly women my age, and the teacher, a young man with paint-splattered jeans, made us laugh with stories of his own terrible first paintings. I wasn't good, not by any stretch, but holding the brush, mixing colors felt like breathing again. My first painting was a mess of blues and greens, a clumsy attempt at the ocean I kept dreaming about. "That's got soul," the teacher said, and I smiled a real smile for the first time in months. Clara from the community center became another unexpected friend. She'd lost her husband young like me and raised 3 kids alone. Over coffee after class, she told me about her daughter who'd stopped speaking to her after a fight over money. "I thought I'd failed her," Clara said, stirring her coffee. "But then I realized she's the one who chose to walk away. I can't carry that forever." Her words hit me like a wave, clear and cold. I hadn't failed Daniel, not in the ways that mattered. I'd given him everything, and he'd chosen to throw it away. The realization didn't erase the pain, but it loosened its grip just a little. I started standing up for myself in small ways. At the grocery store, when the cashier gave me that pitying look again, I met her eyes and said, "I'm doing just fine, thank you." My voice was steady, and she blinked, surprised. At the painting class, when a woman made a snide comment about my abstract ocean, I laughed and said, "It's not for everyone, but it's mine." The words felt good, like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd forgotten. I wasn't loud about it, wasn't angry, but I was done shrinking to make others comfortable. The developer's letter came out of the drawer more often now. I'd sit with it at night, a glass of water in hand, and imagine what selling could mean. Not just money, but freedom, a chance to live for me, not for Daniel's approval or Laura's tolerance. I pictured that cottage by the sea, its windows open to the breeze, and I let myself dream, really dream, for the first time in years. I wasn't ready to call the developer, not yet, but I was closer. The spark in me was a flame now, small but steady, and I knew it wouldn't go out. One evening after painting class, I walked home under a sky streaked with pink and gold. I passed the house, my house without meaning to my feet, carrying me there like they had a mind of their own. Daniel's car was in the driveway, the porch light on. I stood across the street, hidden by the shadow of an oak tree, and watched the windows glow. I could see Laura moving in the kitchen, her silhouette sharp against the curtains. For a moment, I wanted to knock, to beg them to let me in, to be family again. But then I remembered the letter in the trash, the way Daniel's voice had cut through me, and I turned away. I walked home, my scarf tight against the wind, and I felt something new, not just resolve, but purpose. That night, I took out my sewing scraps and started something new, a small quilt just big enough for a child. It wasn't for anyone, not really, but as I stitched, I thought of Emily, of my mother, of the women in the books I'd read. I thought of myself, too, and the life I was starting to build stitch by stitch. The quilt was uneven, the colors mismatched, but it was mine, and it was beautiful. I fell asleep with it draped over my lap, the locket warm against my skin, and I dreamed of the ocean again, its waves calling me home. The flame inside me grew brighter, though it was still a fragile thing, easily dimmed by a stray memory or the sight of a young man who looked too much like Daniel used to. But I was learning to tend it to shield it from the wind of my own doubts. My apartment, once a cage, was becoming a sanctuary, small and imperfect, but mine. The sewing machine hummed most nights now, its rhythm a heartbeat in the quiet. The quilt I'd started was taking shape, its patches of blue and green a patchwork of the ocean I couldn't stop dreaming about. I'd work until my eyes ached, not because I had to, but because creating something felt like proof. I was still here, still Agnes, still worth something. The painting classes at the community center became a ritual every Tuesday and Thursday, a rhythm I could count on. Clara, with her quick laugh and stories of her grandkids, started saving me a spot by the window where the light was best. My paintings were still clumsy, blurry waves, lopsided horizons, but they were honest, and that was enough. The teacher Mark would nod at my canvas and say, "You're telling a story, Agnes. Keep going." I didn't know what story I was telling, not exactly, but I felt it in my bones, a tale of loss and survival of a woman who refused to disappear. I started noticing the world again, not just passing through it. The way the leaves turned crimson in the park, the smell of bread from the bakery on Main Street, the way Ruth's eyes crinkled when she laughed. I'd been so buried in my grief and Daniel's betrayal that I'd forgotten how to see. But now I was looking, and what I saw was possibility. Not the loud, flashy kind, but the quiet sort, the kind that comes from knowing you're not done yet. I was 66, yes, but I wasn't finished. The thought was exhilarating, like a secret I was finally ready to believe. The developer's letter was no longer just a piece of paper in a drawer. I'd taken it to the library where Ruth helped me research the company, their reputation, their offers. She didn't ask, why didn't push, but her steady presence made me feel braver. The numbers were real more money than I'd ever seen enough to buy a new life, a new home, a new start. I started meeting with a lawyer, a quiet man named Mr. Ellis, who worked out of a small office near the park. He was patient, explaining deeds and taxes in a way that didn't make me feel foolish. "This is your property, Mrs. Harper," he said, tapping the paperwork. "Your decision. No one else's." His words landed like a gift, a reminder that I still had power, that Daniel's assumptions didn't change the truth. I didn't tell anyone what I was considering, not even Ruth or Clara. It felt too big, too raw, like a wound I wasn't ready to show, but I was moving toward it, step by careful step. I'd walk by the real estate office on my way home, pausing to look at the cottage by the sea, its picture still in the window. I'd save the photo on my phone, and sometimes late at night I'd pull it up and imagine myself there, the sound of waves through open windows, the salt air on my skin. It wasn't just a house, it was a promise, a life where I could be Agnes, not just Daniel's mother, not just Tom's widow, but me. I started making other changes, small but deliberate. I bought a new dress, a soft blue one that made me feel lighter when I wore it. I hadn't cared about clothes in years, not since Tom died, but standing in front of the mirror, I saw a woman who was still here, still fighting. I wore it to painting class, and Clara clapped her hands saying, "Look at you, Agnes. That's your color." I laughed a real laugh and felt the flame inside me flare. I was reclaiming myself piece by piece, and it felt like coming home. One afternoon, I went to the storage unit to sort through the boxes I'd left behind. I hadn't been back since I retrieved the sewing machine, and the sight of my old life, Tom's books, Emily's stuffed rabbit, my mother's china hit me like a wave. I sat on the concrete floor surrounded by ghosts and let myself cry. Not the heavy, suffocating tears of before, but a release, a letting go. I found a box of letters Tom had written me when we were young, his handwriting bold and sure, and I read them until the light faded. "You're stronger than you know, Aggie," he'd written once. "Don't ever forget it." I folded the letter and tucked it into my pocket, a talisman against the dark. I decided to keep some things and let others go. I donated the china to the community center where Clara said they'd use it for fundraisers. I gave Emily's rabbit to a neighbor's daughter, a shy girl who hugged it like it was treasure. But I kept Tom's letters, my mother's recipe book, and a small painting I'd done in class, the one Mark said had soul. As I locked the storage unit, I felt lighter, like I'd shed a layer of grief I'd been carrying too long. I wasn't erasing my past. I was making room for my future. My house still loomed in my thoughts, but I was starting to see it differently. It wasn't just a home, it was a choice. Daniel had taken it, yes, but I'd let him out of love, out of habit, out of fear. Now I was ready to take it back, not with anger, but with purpose. I called Mr. Ellis and asked him to prepare the paperwork for a sale. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice gentle. I wasn't not completely, but I said yes, because saying it made it real. I didn't tell him where the money would go, didn't mention the cottage by the sea, but I could feel it waiting for me just out of reach. I started visiting the house again, not to confront Daniel, but to say goodbye. I'd walk by at dusk when the light was soft and stand across the street watching the windows glow. I didn't feel anger, not anymore, just a quiet sorrow for what we'd lost. One evening, I saw Daniel in the yard raking leaves, his shoulders hunched. He looked older, tired, and for a moment I wanted to call out to him to bridge the gap between us. But then I remembered the letter in the trash, the way he'd turned me away, and I kept walking. I wasn't ready to forgive, not yet, but I was ready to let go. Back at my apartment, I pulled out the quilt and added a new patch, a scrap of blue from the dress I'd bought. As I stitched, I thought about my mother, how she'd taught me to make something beautiful from what was left. I thought about Tom, about Emily, about the life I'd built and lost and was building again. The quilt was nearly done now, a map of my heart, and I knew I'd take it with me wherever I went. I fell asleep with it across my knees, the locket warm against my skin, and dreamed of the ocean, its waves softer now like a lullaby. The next morning, I called the developer. My voice was steady, my heart racing. "I'd like to discuss selling my property," I said, and the words felt like a door opening. The woman on the phone was polite, professional, and we set a meeting for the following week. I hung up and sat at my kitchen table, the sewing machine silent, the quilt folded neatly beside me. I didn't know what would happen next, didn't know if I was making the right choice, but I knew it was mine. For the first time in years, I felt like I was steering my own life, and that was enough. The meeting with the developer was set for a Tuesday, and as the day approached, I felt a strange calm settle over me, like the stillness before a sunrise. It wasn't that the fear was gone, there was plenty of that curling in my stomach like smoke, but it was tempered by something stronger, something I hadn't felt in years, certainty. I was Agnes, 66 years old, and I was choosing my own path, not because I wanted to hurt Daniel, but because I needed to save myself. The house, my childhood home, had been my heart for so long, but it was also a chain tethering me to a past that no longer fit. I was ready to let it go, to see what lay beyond its walls. I prepared carefully as if for a ceremony. I met with Mr. Ellis again, going over the deed, the tax implications, the numbers that still felt unreal. He was kind but firm, making sure I understood every step. "This is a big decision, Agnes," he said, peering over his glasses. "Once it's done, there's no going back." I nodded, my hands folded in my lap, and told him I was sure. I wasn't not entirely, but I was sure enough. I wore my blue dress to the meeting, the one that made me feel lighter, and I pinned my hair up the way my mother used to, simple but elegant. I looked in the mirror before leaving and saw a woman who was tired, yes, but also alive, her eyes bright with purpose. The developer's office was sleek, all glass and polished wood, a world away from the creaky floors of my house. The woman who greeted me, Ms. Carter, was younger than I'd expected, with a sharp smile and a handshake that was all business. She led me to a conference room where a man in a suit joined us, his voice smooth as he explained the offer. The number was higher than the letter had promised, thanks to a new zoning approval that made my property prime real estate. He called it even more valuable. I listened, my face calm, but inside my heart was racing. This was real. This was happening. I asked questions once I'd practiced with Ruth at the library. What would happen to the house demolished, likely for a new development? How long would the process take? A few weeks once the paperwork was signed. What were the terms? Cash up front with a small percentage held in escrow. Ms. Carter answered patiently, her pen tapping the table, and I felt a quiet pride in holding my own. I wasn't just a grieving mother or a discarded widow. I was a woman making a choice, and they respected that, or at least they acted like they did. I didn't sign anything that day. I told them I needed time, and they nodded, handing me a folder with the updated offer. As I left, Ms. Carter touched my arm and said, "You're doing the right thing, Mrs. Harper. This is a fresh start." I smiled, not sure if I believed her, but grateful for the sentiment. I walked home, the folder heavy in my bag, and felt the town around me, the hum of construction, the chatter of new families like a tide pulling me forward. The house wasn't mine anymore, not in the way it had been. It was time to let it go. That night, I finished the quilt. I'd been working on it for weeks, adding scraps from my life, a piece of Emily's old blanket, a strip from one of Tom's shirts, the blue from my new dress. It wasn't perfect, the stitches uneven in places, but it was beautiful, a map of where I'd been and where I was going. I draped it over the back of my chair and sat with a cup of tea, the locket warm against my chest. I thought about my parents, how they'd built that house with love, how they'd left it to me because they trusted me to carry it forward. I wasn't betraying them by selling. I was honoring them by choosing life, by refusing to let their gift become a prison. I started planning quietly in the margins of my days. I looked up the cottage by the sea, the one from the real estate window. It was still for sale, its price within reach if the developer's offer went through. I called the agent, a kind woman named Susan, and asked for details. She sent me photos, white walls, wide windows, a porch overlooking the waves, and I could almost feel the salt air on my skin. I didn't commit, not yet, but I let myself imagine it mornings with coffee on the porch, evenings sewing by the window, the quilt across my knees. It wasn't just a house. It was a life, one I could build for myself. I kept going to painting class, my canvases growing bolder, the blues and greens sharper now like the ocean in my dreams. Clara noticed, saying, "You're painting with confidence, Agnes. Something's changed." I smiled, not ready to share, but she was right. Something had changed. I was standing taller, speaking clearer, carrying myself like a woman who knew her worth. At the library, Ruth handed me a book about a woman who'd moved to a new country at 70, starting over with nothing but her courage. "This one's for you," she said, and I took it home, reading late into the night, my heart full. I stopped avoiding the house. I'd walk by it deliberately now, not to spy, but to reclaim it in my own way. I'd stand across the street under the oak tree and remember the good moments, Tom fixing the porch swing, Emily chasing fireflies, my mother's laughter in the kitchen. Those memories were mine, not Daniel's, and selling the house wouldn't take them away. One evening I saw Laura in the yard watering the flowers I'd planted years ago. She didn't see me and I didn't call out. I just watched, feeling a strange peace. The house was hers for now, but it wouldn't be for long. I met with Mr. Ellis again, and this time I brought the developer's folder. We went over the offer line by line, and I told him I was ready to move forward. He drafted a letter of intent, a step short of a contract, and I signed it, my hand steady. "You're sure?" he asked one last time. I nodded, thinking of the cottage, the quilt, the woman I was becoming. I'm sure I said and meant it. The process would take time, inspections, appraisals, paperwork, but it was started, and that was enough. I began to let go of other things, too. I wrote a letter to Daniel, not to send, but to free myself. I poured out everything, the love, the pain, the betrayal, the hope I'd held on to for too long. I wrote about Emily, about Tom, about the mother I'd tried to be. When I was done, I folded it and tucked it into the box with Tom's letters, a piece of my heart I didn't need to carry anymore. I felt lighter, like I'd set down a burden I hadn't known I was holding. One night after painting class, Clara invited me to her house for dinner. It was simple, pasta salad, a glass of wine, but it felt like a celebration. We talked about our lives, our losses, our small victories. She told me about a trip she'd taken to the coast, how the ocean had made her feel whole again. "You should go, Agnes," she said, her eyes bright. "There's something about the sea." I smiled, thinking of the cottage, and said, "Maybe I will." I didn't tell her about the sale, about the plans forming in my mind, but I felt her belief in me, and it was enough. I fell asleep that night with the quilt over me, the locket against my skin, and dreamed of the ocean again. This time I was standing on the shore, the waves lapping at my feet, and I wasn't afraid. I was home. I woke with a smile, the first light of dawn spilling through the window, and I knew I was ready for what came next. The house was slipping away, but I was gaining something greater myself. The days after signing the letter of intent felt like walking on a tightrope, a delicate balance between fear and freedom. I'd wake each morning with a flutter in my chest, half expecting to regret my choice, but the regret never came. Instead, there was a quiet thrill, like the moment before a storm when the air hums with possibility. I was Agnes 66, and I was rewriting my story not with fanfare or vengeance, but with the steady determination of a woman who'd finally remembered her own name. The house, my childhood home, my anchor, my burden was slipping from my grasp, and I was letting it go. Not because I wanted to, but because I had to. It was the only way to keep moving forward. The developer's process moved faster than I'd expected. Ms. Carter called with updates, her voice crisp but kind, walking me through appraisals and inspections. The house, she said, was a gold mine, its large lot, and proximity to the new highway making it perfect for a commercial development. I listened, my hands wrapped around a mug of tea, and tried to picture it gone bulldozed, replaced by concrete and glass. It hurt a deep, aching hurt, but it also felt right, like pruning a tree to let it grow stronger. The money, when it came, would be life-changing enough to buy the cottage by the sea, and more enough to ensure I'd never need Daniel's approval or Laura's tolerance again. I met with Susan, the real estate agent for the cottage, in a small cafe near the library. She was warm, her eyes crinkling when she smiled, and she spread photos of the property across the table like a deck of cards. "It's a special place," she said, pointing to the porch, the wide windows, the path to the beach. Perfect for someone starting fresh. I nodded my fingers, tracing the edges of the photos, and told her I was interested but not ready to commit. She didn't push, just handed me her card and said, "When you're ready, Agnes, it'll be waiting." I left the cafe with a lightness in my step, the possibility of that cottage like a lighthouse in my mind guiding me forward. I kept sewing the quilt now, a constant companion. I'd added final touches, a border of white from an old tablecloth, a patch from a scarf Tom bought me on our honeymoon. It was done, or as done as it would ever be, and I hung it over the back of my couch, its colors catching the light. It wasn't just a quilt. It was a testament proof that I could take the scraps of my life and make something whole. I'd catch myself looking at it during the day, smiling at the uneven stitches, and I'd feel a surge of pride. I'd made this, me, and no one could take that away. Painting class became a place of transformation. My canvases were bolder now, the ocean no longer a blur, but a living thing, its waves curling with purpose. Mark, the teacher, started calling me our resident seascape artist, and the other women laughed, clapping me on the shoulder. Clara, ever my cheerleader, framed one of my paintings, a small one all blues and greens, and hung it in the community center's hallway. "You're leaving a mark, Agnes," she said, and I blushed, but I didn't disagree. I was leaving a mark not just on canvas, but on myself, carving out a space where I could be whole again. Ruth at the library noticed the change too. "You're glowing," she said one afternoon, handing me a book about women who'd reinvented themselves later in life. "Something's shifted." I smiled, sipping our usual chamomile, and told her about the painting, the quilt, the walks that felt like promises. I didn't mention the house, the sale, the cottage, not because I didn't trust her, but because it was still too tender, like a seed, not yet sprouted. She didn't press, just squeezed my hand and said, "I'm proud of you, Agnes. Whatever it is, you're doing it." Her words stayed with me, a warmth I carried home like a candle against the dark. I started taking bigger steps, ones that scared me. I opened a new bank account separate from the one I'd shared with Tom and had Mr. Ellis set it up for the sale proceeds. It felt strange, almost disloyal to have something just for me, but it was also liberating. I bought a few things for myself, a new pair of shoes, a journal with a leather cover, a set of paints for home. Small things, but they felt like declarations, like saying, "I'm here and I'm worth this." I wrote in the journal at night, not about Daniel or the house, but about me, what I wanted, what I dreamed, what I was becoming. The pages filled with words I hadn't known I had, and I realized I was writing a new chapter, one where I was the hero, not the victim. I stopped walking by the house, not because it hurt, but because it didn't matter anymore. The memories were mine, locked in my heart, and the building itself was just wood and brick, a shell I no longer needed. I heard from a neighbor that Daniel and Laura were renovating, putting in new floors, painting the walls. The news stung, but only for a moment. They were building a life on borrowed time, and I wasn't angry, not anymore. I was too busy building my own. One evening after painting class, I went to the park and sat by the pond watching the ducks glide across the water. The air was crisp, the sky streaked with gold, and I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. I took out my journal and wrote a single line: "I am enough." It was simple, but it was everything. I closed the book, slipped it into my bag, and walked home, the locket bouncing against my chest. That night, I dreamed of Emily not as a child, but as a woman, standing on a beach, her smile bright. "You're doing it, Mommy," she said, and I woke with tears in my eyes, but they were joyful like rain after a drought. The developer called with a final offer higher than the last, and I met with Miss Carter and Mr. Ellis to sign the contract. My hand didn't shake, not once. "You're making a smart move," Miss Carter said, and I nodded, but I wasn't thinking about the money. I was thinking about the cottage, the quilt, the life waiting for me. The closing would take a few weeks, but it was done. The house was sold, or would be soon, and I was free. I called Susan the next day and told her I wanted the cottage. She was thrilled, her voice bubbling over the phone, and we set a date to visit. I didn't tell anyone else, not yet. It was my secret, my gift to myself, and I held it close like a child clutching a treasure. I started packing, not much, just the quilt, my paints, Tom's letters, Emily's locket. The rest could stay or go or burn for all I cared. I was traveling light, carrying only what mattered. The night before the cottage visit, I sat at my kitchen table, the quilt across my lap, and wrote in my journal. I wrote about my mother, how she'd taught me to stand tall. I wrote about Tom, how he'd loved me fiercely, flaws and all. I wrote about Emily, how her brief life had shaped mine. And I wrote about Daniel, not with anger, but with a kind of sad clarity. I loved him, always would, but I couldn't save him, not from himself, not from his choices. I could only save me. I closed the journal, turned off the light, and went to bed. The locket was warm against my skin, the quilt soft under my hands, and I dreamed of the ocean, its waves calling me home. I was ready not just for the cottage, but for everything. The life, the love, the woman I was becoming. I was Agnes, and I was enough. The morning I visited the cottage by the sea, the sky was a perfect blue, the kind that makes you believe in new beginnings. I drove with Susan, the real estate agent, in her little red car, the windows down the air sharp with salt and promise. My hands were steady on my lap, but my heart raced, not with fear, but with a kind of wild hope I hadn't felt since I was young. I was Agnes, 66, and I was on the edge of something new, something mine. The quilt was in my bag, its weight a comfort, and the locket hung against my chest, a quiet reminder of the love I'd carried through every storm. The cottage was even more beautiful than the photos. It sat on a gentle rise, its white walls glowing in the sunlight, its wide windows catching the sparkle of the waves. The porch wrapped around like an embrace, and the path to the beach was lined with wildflowers, their colors bold against the sand. Susan walked me through, pointing out the hardwood floors, the airy kitchen, the bedroom with a view of the horizon. But I didn't need the details. I felt it the moment I stepped inside, a sense of home, not the heavy, memory-laden kind I'd known, but something lighter, something that belonged to me alone. "What do you think Susan asked, her eyes bright?" I smiled, my voice soft, but sure. "It's perfect." I made an offer that day, and Susan said it was as good as done pending the sale of my house. The developer's closing was set for the following week, the paperwork finalized, the money ready to transfer. I drove back to my apartment with the windows still down, the wind tangling my hair, and I felt like I was flying. For the first time in years, I wasn't looking back, wasn't tethered to Daniel's rejection or the house's ghosts. I was moving forward, and it was exhilarating. I didn't tell anyone about the cottage, not Ruth, not Clara, not even Mr. Ellis. It was mine, a secret I savored like a letter you keep close to your heart. But I did tell them about the sale in bits and pieces as the closing approached. Ruth squeezed my hand at the library, her eyes shining. "You're brave, Agnes," she said. "Braver than most." Clara, over coffee after painting class, raised her mug in a toast. "To new chapters," she said, and I clinked my cup against hers, my throat tight with gratitude. They didn't know the whole story, didn't know about Daniel or the cottage, but they knew I was changing, and their belief in me was a lifeline. The closing day came, and I wore my blue dress, the one that made me feel like myself. Mr. Ellis met me at the developer's office, his briefcase stuffed with papers. Miss Carter was there along with the man in the suit, their smiles polished but genuine. We sat at the conference table, and I signed where they pointed, my hand steady, my heart calm. The house was gone, or would be soon, its lot cleared for something new. The money, more than I'd ever imagined, was wired to my new account, and Mr. Ellis handed me a statement with numbers that made my head spin. "You're set, Agnes," he said quietly. "You've done well." I didn't feel the loss I'd expected. The house was a memory now, not a weight, and I was free. I thanked Ms. Carter, shook the man's hand, and walked out into the sunlight, the folder with the closing papers tucked under my arm. I drove to the park, sat by the pond, and let myself breathe. The ducks glided across the water, the air smelled of grass and earth, and I felt a peace so deep it was almost sacred. I took out my journal and wrote, "Today I let go. Today I began." Then I closed it, slipped it into my bag, and went home. I packed the last of my things that week, Tom's letters, Emily's locket, the quilt, my paints, a few clothes. The apartment was nearly empty, its walls bare, but it didn't feel sad. It felt like a chapter closing gently with grace. I called Susan and confirmed the cottage purchase, the money ready to transfer. She said I could move in within days, and I laughed a sound that surprised me with its joy. "I'm ready," I told her, and I meant it. I didn't know Daniel had been to the house until a neighbor called her voice hesitant. "Agnes, I thought you should know. Daniel was here yesterday. He saw the sold sign." My heart stuttered, but I stayed calm, stirring my tea as I listened. "He was upset," she said, "yelling about how it was his house, how you had no right. Laura was with him trying to calm him down, but he wouldn't listen." I thanked her, hung up, and sat in silence, the quilt across my lap. I pictured him standing in the yard, his face red, his voice loud, and I felt a pang, not guilt, but sorrow for the boy he'd been, for the man he'd become. He didn't call me, didn't reach out. I hadn't expected him to. Daniel's world was built on assumptions that the house was his, that I'd always give, that I'd never walk away. The sold sign was a truth he couldn't ignore, a quiet reckoning delivered without a word. I didn't need to confront him, didn't need to explain. The act itself was enough a line drawn in the sand, not with anger, but with dignity. I was done being invisible, done letting his choices define me. I moved to the cottage 3 days later. Susan handed me the keys, her smile wide, and I stepped inside the quilt under my arm, the locket against my skin. The air smelled of salt and wood. The windows let in a breeze that felt like a welcome. I set the quilt on the couch, hung my painting, the one Clara had framed on the wall, and stood on the porch watching the waves. I was home not just in a place, but in myself. I was Agnes, and I was whole. I heard later, through the same neighbor, that Daniel had gone back to the house again, this time alone. He'd stood in the empty yard, the sold sign stark against the grass, and he'd cried. Not loud, not dramatic, but quiet, like a man who'd lost something he didn't know he had. Laura had left him. The neighbor said tired of his gambling, his debts, his temper. He was alone now, living in a rented room, starting over with nothing. I didn't feel triumph, didn't feel joy. I felt a deep, aching sadness, but also a clarity I'd done what I had to for me, for the life I deserved. I didn't reach out to him. Maybe I will one day if he comes to me, if he's ready to listen. But for now, I'm here in my cottage, painting the sea, sewing new quilts, writing in my journal. Ruth and Clara visit sometimes, their laughter filling the porch, and I've made new friends, neighbors, artists, women like me, who found their way later in life. The money from the sale is more than enough a cushion for the years ahead, but it's not what matters. What matters is, this I chose myself, and I'm at peace. I walk the beach every morning, the sand cool under my feet, and I think of Tom, of Emily, of my mother. They're with me not as ghosts, but as light woven into the woman I've become. I don't know what Daniel thinks of me now, don't know if he understands what he lost, but I know what I've gained, and it's enough. The dawn breaks gently here at my cottage by the sea, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold that feel like a promise whispered just for me. I rise early, not out of duty, but because the world feels too beautiful to miss each morning a canvas I'm eager to step into. I brew coffee strong the way Tom always teased me about, though he'd sip it with a grin and carry it to the porch, wrapping myself in the quilt I stitched from the fragments of my life. The waves roll in their rhythm a heartbeat, and I sit there, Agnes, 66 years old, feeling more alive than I ever dreamed I could. The locket with Emily's tiny picture inside rests warm against my chest, a quiet tether to the loves I've carried through every storm, every joy. This cottage isn't just a house. It's a sanctuary, a place where I've found myself again. Its white walls glow with the colors I've chosen, blues and greens, that echo the sea, and my paintings hang proudly, their rough edges, a testament to my courage. The quilt with its patches of Emily's blanket, Tom's shirt, and the blue of my new dress drapes over the couch, a tapestry of survival of beauty born from broken things. I've started another smaller quilt, not for anyone, but for the simple joy of creating my needle moving to the song of the waves through open windows. At night, I write in my leather-bound journal no longer about the pain that once defined me, but about the hope that lights my way, the woman I've become, the life I've built from the ruins of what was. Daniel crosses my mind sometimes, not with the sharp, searing grief of before, but with a softer ache like a bruise that's faded but never quite disappears. A neighbor from my old town, her voice always careful, sends me word of him now and then. He's still in that rented room, she tells me, piecing together a life from odd jobs, his gambling debts, a shadow he's trying to outrun. Laura's gone, her patience worn thin by his recklessness, and he's alone now, starting from nothing. I don't know if he regrets the words he spoke, "You're not family anymore," or if he understands the weight of what he threw away. I don't know if he ever will. As a mother, I'll always love him. My boy with the spark in his eyes, but I've learned that love doesn't mean sacrificing myself to his choices. I've let him go, not with bitterness, but with a quiet necessity, like releasing a kite that's tangled in the wind. The house, my childhood home with its creaky floors and chipped paint, is gone now. Its lot cleared for a shopping center, all glass and steel, a place for new stories to unfold. The developer sent a final letter confirming the sale, the money safely in my account, and I filed it away, a door closed with care. It doesn't hurt to think of it not anymore. The house lives in my heart, in the laughter of my mother, braiding my hair in Tom's whistle, as he fixed the porch swing, and Emily's giggles as she chased fireflies. Those moments are mine, untouchable, woven into the fabric of who I am. No machine can erase them. No sale can take them away. Ruth and Clara visited a few weeks ago, their car pulling up with a burst of laughter that felt like sunlight. We sat on the porch sipping tea, eating Clara's homemade lemon cake, and they marveled at the cottage, at the life I've carved out. "You've done something extraordinary," Agnes Ruth said, her eyes soft with pride. I showed them the quilt, the paintings, the journal pages filled with my truth, and they listened, their presence a balm to wounds I no longer carry. "To you," Clara said, raising her glass, and I clinked mine against hers, my throat tight with gratitude. They left with hugs and promises to return, and I stood on the porch, waving my heart full. I'm not alone, not the way I was in those gray, silent days. I have friends, neighbors, a circle of women who see me, who know my worth, who remind me I'm not invisible. I walk the beach each morning, the sand cool and firm under my feet, collecting shells that catch the light like tiny miracles. I've planted a garden behind the cottage. Nothing grand, just wildflowers and lavender, the kind my mother used to grow. I kneel in the dirt, my hands strong, and I think of her, how she'd smile to see me here, thriving unafraid. I found new rhythms yoga at the community center down the coast, where I stretch my body and laugh at my own clumsiness. A book club where we debate stories and share wine, our voices loud with life. I'm not young, not by the world's measure, but I'm not finished, and that's a truth I hold like a treasure, a flame that burns steady in my chest. I don't know if I'll ever speak to Daniel again. Maybe one day, if he finds his way to me, if he's ready to listen, to see me as more than a mother he could cast aside. I'm open to that possibility, but I don't need it to be whole. My peace comes from within, from the choices I've made, from the life I've built on my own terms. I've forgiven him not because he's earned it, but because I deserve to be free. Forgiveness, I've come to understand, isn't about erasing the pain. It's about choosing to live beyond it, to let it rest in the past where it belongs. I think of you, the women watching this, women like me, who've been told your time is up, that you're too old, too quiet, too broken to matter. I think of the mothers who've poured their hearts into children who turned away, the wives who've lost husbands to death, or betrayal, the women who've been diminished by the very people they loved most. I want you to hear this, to hold it close. Your worth isn't defined by who accepts you, who stays, who sees you. It's defined by how you choose to honor yourself, by the quiet strength that carries you through the dark. You are enough exactly as you are, and you always have been. Don't let anyone, not your children, not your family, not the world, convince you otherwise. Yesterday, I planted a small lilac bush in the garden, its roots tucked deep in the sandy earth. It's not for me, not for anyone living, but for the future, for the woman who'll walk this path long after I'm gone. I watered it, my hands steady, and I thought of Emily, of the maple tree we planted when she was born, its leaves still dancing somewhere far from here. I thought of Tom, of my mother, of the love that's shaped me, and I felt a joy so deep it was almost holy. That night, I lit a candle on the porch, its flame steady in the breeze, and I stood there watching it glow against the dark. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a vow to myself, to the life I've chosen, to the woman I've become. I'm Agnes, and this is my story, not an ending, but a beginning, a chapter written in salt air and sunlight. I'm here in my cottage by the sea, living with grace, with dignity, with a heart that's learned to sing again. I've lost much, but I've gained more myself, my truth, my freedom. And I'm not going anywhere, not until I'm ready, not until the sea itself calls me home. I walk the beach as the sun rises, the waves lapping at my feet, and I feel the weight of my life not heavy, but full, like a basket brimming with treasures. I think of the women who came before me, my mother with her steady hands, my grandmother with her quiet faith. I think of the women who'll come after the ones who'll find their own cottages, their own seas, their own ways to stand tall. I'm part of that chain, a link forged in love and loss, in courage and choice. And I'm proud not just of what I've done, but of who I am. The money from the house sits in my account, a safety net I rarely think about. It's there, yes, enough for years of comfort, but it's not what defines me. What defines me is this: the quilt on my couch, the paintings on my walls, the journal filled with my words, the lilac bush growing in my garden. What defines me is the way I've chosen to live, not for Daniel, not for anyone, but for myself. I've learned that love is vast, that it can hold pain and peace in the same breath, that it can set you free even as it binds you to those you've lost. I don't know what Daniel's future holds, don't know if he'll find his way, if he'll ever understand the cost of his words. But I know my future, or at least its shape. A life of mornings on the porch, of walks along the shore, of laughter with friends who see me as I am. I know I'll keep painting, keep sewing, keep writing, keep planting, keep living until my last breath. And when that day comes, I'll go with a smile knowing I've lived fully, fiercely on my own terms. So here I am, Agnes, telling you my story, not because it's unique, but because it's true. I've been broken, betrayed, cast aside, but I've also been reborn, not through grand gestures, but through quiet, deliberate choices. I found my sea, my home, my heart. And I want you to find yours, wherever it may be, whatever it may look like. You deserve it not because of what you've done or who you've loved, but because you're you, and that's enough. I light another candle tonight, its flame a beacon in the dark, and I whisper a wish, not just for me, but for you. May you find your strength, your peace, your place in the world. May you know as I do that you are enough.